She was 18 years old, and she owned nothing in the world but $46, a dead man's pocket watch, and a dog. The town of Larkspur Hollow had just finished burying the last of her family, and the man who had signed the papers that put her mother in the ground was the same man who now told her, not unkindly, but not kindly either, that the boarding house was his now, and that she had until Sunday to be gone. She counted her coins twice that night by lamplight, and found that all the money left to her in this world would not buy a bed, or a wagon, or even a decent coat for the coming winter, but it was, as fate would have it, exactly $1 more than the asking price of a collapsed, condemned, thoroughly worthless mine shaft on the North Ridge that no living soul in the county wanted, on account of the men who had died in it, and the curse that folks said clung to its timbers. She bought it anyway, for $1, with her father's own watch in her pocket, and her father's own dog, a red-coated hound named Duke, pressed close against her skirts, as if he already knew, in the way dogs know things before people do, that something inside that mountain was waiting only for them. It was, by every reasonable measure, a foolish and desperate purchase. But sealed behind that rockfall was a secret that would take nearly a year to drag into the light, a secret that would restore a wronged town to itself, and settle an old debt of blood and silver. And it began, as the truest stories often do, with a girl who had nothing, and a dog who would not stop digging. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Josephine Hartley and her faithful dog Duke. If this story of quiet courage and buried truth moves something in you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And stay with us, because Josephine's story is only just beginning. Josephine Hartley had been born in the spring of 1871, in a canvas tent pitched on the very slope where Larkspur Hollow would rise, brick by brick and board by board, over the following decade. Her father, Thomas Hartley, was not a rich man, nor an important one by the standards of the Colorado mining companies that had drawn half the county up into the mountains chasing silver, but he was, by every account that mattered, a good one, and he possessed a gift that the other men respected, even when they didn't understand it. He could read stone the way a preacher read scripture, running his thick fingers along a seam of rock and telling you, calm as Sunday, whether it held ore worth a man's labor or nothing but false hope and heartbreak. He taught his daughter to do the same, out of some private conviction that a girl ought to know a trade as surely as a boy. And so Josephine grew up with quartz and mica dust under her fingernails, learning the language of veins and faults, and the patient grammar of the mountain long before she learned her letters properly. Her mother, Eleanor, ran the town's only respectable boarding house, a long clapboard building with a green door that Thomas had painted himself, and it was there that Josephine learned her second trade, the keeping of ledgers and the balancing of accounts, a skill that would matter more than anyone could have guessed. The Hartleys were not wealthy, but they were whole, and in a town built on the uncertain fortunes of silver, wholeness was its own kind of riches. The dog came into her life the winter she turned 11, a wet-nosed, red-brown pup, born in the loft above the Larkspur livery, the runt of a litter sired by the blacksmith's old hunting hound. Thomas had gone to look at the pups meaning to choose the strongest for the mine's rat-catching, but Josephine had knelt in the straw, and the smallest pup had climbed directly into her lap, and refused to leave it, and that had settled the matter more thoroughly than any argument could have. They named him Duke, for no grander reason than that Josephine liked the sound of it, and from that day, the two of them were rarely seen apart. Duke trotting at her heel to school, Duke waiting patient as a stone outside the boarding house kitchen door, Duke curled at the foot of her bed through every one of the mountain's long winters. Thomas used to say, half in jest, that the dog understood more of the mountain's secrets than any surveyor in the territory, on account of how Duke would sometimes stop dead on a trail and refuse to go another step, only to have Thomas discover, days later, unstable ground, or a hidden sinkhole, exactly where the dog had balked. It was a small thing, a father's fond exaggeration, but Josephine held on to it in the years that followed, the way a person holds onto any small proof that the people they've lost had seen something true in the world before it took them. There were smaller mercies scattered through those childhood years too, the kind a person only recognizes as mercies once they are gone. Josephine remembered summer evenings on the boarding house porch, when her father would come home black to the elbows, with rock dust, and let her wash his hands in the basin herself, naming for her, patient as any schoolteacher, the difference between mica and quartz, and the dull gray promise of galena, until she could close her eyes and name a stone by its weight alone. She remembered her mother's kitchen, always smelling of yeast and wood smoke, and the boarders who passed through it, drummers and prospectors, and once, memorably, a traveling photographer who left behind a tintype of the whole family, standing stiff and solemn on the porch steps. Duke a blur of motion at their feet, because no dog, however well loved, could be persuaded to hold still for the long exposure. Eleanor Hartley kept that boarding house's books herself, refusing every offer from well-meaning neighbors to hire a man for the figures, and she taught her daughter at the same kitchen table where Thomas taught her rock, so that by the time Josephine was 15, she could balance a ledger to the penny, and could tell, from nothing more than a column of numbers, when an account had been quietly and carefully altered. It was a small, homely sort of education, taught by two ordinary and devoted parents, who never once guessed how completely their daughter would come to need both halves of it. Thomas Hartley worked, in those years, as a surveyor and shift foreman for the Pruitt mining concern, the largest operation in Larkspur Hollow, owned outright by a narrow, soft-spoken man named Silas Pruitt, who had come west, with Eastern money, and a talent for arithmetic that served him better than any pickaxe ever could. Pruitt was, on the surface, a pillar of the town. He funded the church roof, he sat on the town council, he shook every hand at every social with the same measured warmth. But Thomas had come home more than once in those final months, with a furrowed brow and a closed mouth, the particular silence of a man who has seen something in his ledgers or his rock samples that he does not yet know how to say out loud. He had been assigned, that autumn, to survey a played-out shaft on the North Ridge that the company had officially declared exhausted 3 years prior, and though he never told Josephine exactly what he found there, she remembered him coming home one evening with stone dust ground so deep into his palms that no washing would lift it, and remembered him sitting up long past midnight with his private notebook, the one bound in oilcloth that he kept always in his coat, writing by lamplight in a hand too small and hurried for her to read over his shoulder. 3 weeks later, that same North Ridge shaft collapsed with Thomas Hartley inside it, along with 2 other miners, in what the company's official report called an act of nature, old timbers, shifting rock, nothing more. The town mourned properly, as towns do, and Silas Pruitt himself stood at the graveside, with his hat pressed to his chest, and spoke movingly of a man taken too soon, and for a long while Josephine believed, because she had no reason yet to believe otherwise, that the mountain had simply done what mountains sometimes do. Eleanor Hartley did not have long to grieve before grief itself seemed to hollow her out entirely. She took a winter fever, that first hard December after Thomas's death, and never fully shook it, coughing through 2 more winters on a chest that grew weaker each year, until the fever returned with the deep snows the winter Josephine turned 18 and took her mother in 11 days, quick and merciless, leaving the girl to close her mother's eyes with her own hands, while Duke pressed his broad head against Eleanor's cooling fingers, as though he might will them warm again. The boarding house, it turned out, had been mortgaged twice over in the lean years after Thomas's death, and the note belonged, as so many notes in Larkspur Hollow eventually did, to Silas Pruitt, who arrived within the week of the funeral, gentle-voiced and apologetic, to inform Josephine that the property would revert to him, and that she had until Sunday. She left the green-doored boarding house on a Saturday morning, with a single carpet bag, her father's pocket watch, her mother's wedding ring sewn into her hem, where no thief would think to look, $46 folded into a handkerchief, and Duke walking so close against her leg that she stumbled twice trying not to step on him. She had, that first night, no plan beyond finding work as a laundress or a hired girl in some other town down the rail line, and it was only by accident, or by whatever force guides a grieving person's feet, that she passed by the courthouse steps and saw the notice pinned there among the tax sales and stray livestock announcements. The old Northridge shaft, the Hartley shaft as some still quietly called it, though the company had never named it for her father, condemned, sealed, and offered for $1 to any fool willing to take the liability off the county's books, since Pruitt Mining had long since written the whole claim off as worthless. Josephine stood on those steps a long time, with Duke sitting patient at her feet, and she could not afterwards say exactly why the sight of that notice put a lump in her throat that grief alone had not managed, except that it was the place that had taken her father, and something in her, some unfinished, unspoken part of her, that had never quite believed the official report, wanted, more than she wanted a warm bed or a full stomach, simply to stand inside it and understand. She paid her dollar to a bored county clerk who seemed faintly amused that anyone would want the deed at all, and walked the 3 miles up the ridge road with Duke ranging ahead of her through the pines, and when she came at last to the sealed mouth of the shaft, a crude timber barricade nailed across a rockfall, weathered gray, half buried already in drifted needles and 3 winters' worth of scree, she sat down on a stump across from it, and simply looked at it for a long while, the last of her family's money spent, her family's grave bought and paid for a second time in a manner nobody living would have called sensible. Duke did not sit beside her. He went instead, directly to the barricade, sniffed along its base with an intensity she had not seen in him since he was a pup on the scent of something, and began, with a low and urgent whine, to dig. He dug at that barricade every day she brought him back to it, through the last mild weeks of autumn, and into the first hard frosts, always at the same low point on the eastern edge, where the old timbers met the rock, never tiring of it, though his paws grew raw, and Josephine had to bind them some evenings, with strips of her petticoat. She told herself at first that he was only chasing a marmot, or a fox, that had denned in the rubble, and she nearly gave up the whole venture twice, once when a week of rain turned the ridge road to a river of mud, and once when a neighbor woman in the miners' camp where she'd taken a room, told her flatly that she was chasing a dead man's ghost, and ought to let the mountain keep its secrets. But Duke would not be argued out of it, and there was something in his particular focus, the way he ignored every rabbit, and every distraction the forest offered him, that Josephine had learned long ago to trust more than her own doubts. She began, in November, to clear the barricade herself, prying loose the rotted timbers one at a time with a borrowed pry bar, and it was on a gray afternoon, with the season's first real snow threatening, that Duke suddenly stopped digging at the main rockfall altogether, trotted 20 feet along the base of the ridge to a place where a stand of scrub oak grew close against the mountain, and began instead to dig there, at what looked to Josephine's eye like nothing more than undisturbed hillside. It took her the better part of 3 more days, working before and after the hours she'd taken cleaning rooms at the camp boarding house to keep herself fed, to understand what Duke already seemed to know, that the oak grove was not natural at all, but had been planted, deliberately and long ago, to disguise a second, smaller opening into the mountain, a hand-cut side tunnel braced with timbers far newer than anything in the main condemned shaft, sealed at its mouth with a wall of fitted stone, made to look, at a careless glance, like simple rockfall. Her father's private notebook, the oilcloth-bound one she had never once seen him without in the last months of his life, and which had never been returned to the family among his effects, she found tucked into a hollowed niche, just inside that false wall, wrapped in oilskin against the damp, along with 3 chunks of ore so heavy with visible silver, that even Josephine's untrained eye could see they were nothing like the exhausted rock the company had reported from that shaft. What her father had written, in that small hurried hand she remembered from countless evenings at the kitchen table, was this: that the North Ridge shaft was not exhausted at all, but held the richest vein Thomas Hartley had encountered in 15 years of reading Colorado rock, a vein his own survey estimated at a value that would have made every miner and every widow in Larkspur Hollow a comfortable living for a generation. He had reported this discovery, in writing, to Silas Pruitt directly, 3 weeks before the collapse. And in the notebook's final entries, written in a hand grown tighter and more anxious with each passing page, Thomas recorded his growing dread that Pruitt meant to bury the discovery, rather than share its profits. To declare the shaft worthless, quietly buy out the smaller shareholders and the miners' own modest stakes in the claim at pennies on the dollar, and then, once the company was his alone, and his alone again, reopen the vein under a story of new prospecting that would let him keep the whole fortune for himself, cutting out the very men whose labor, and whose lives, the mountain had already claimed. Thomas had written that he intended to bring his findings before the whole town, the miners and the shareholders together, at the next company meeting. The collapse came 4 days before that meeting was to be held. Josephine sat in the mouth of that hidden tunnel with the notebook open on her knees, and Duke's head heavy and warm against her side, and she wept for the first time since her mother's funeral, not only for her father, but for the plain, terrible shape of what had been done to him, and to the town that had grieved him without ever knowing why he had truly died. She did not act rashly, whatever grief and anger urged her toward. She had her mother's bookkeeping in her, after all, and she understood, turning the notebook's pages by lamplight through that winter, that proof was a fragile thing, and Silas Pruitt was neither a fool nor a man without friends in high places, including a county sheriff who owed his position, everyone in Larkspur Hollow understood without saying, to Pruitt's quiet backing. She spent the winter months working by day at the camp boarding house, and by night, cross-referencing her father's survey figures against the company's own public assay reports, which she obtained, patiently, and without arousing suspicion, from the assayer's clerk, a kind widower named Mr. Osgood, who remembered her father fondly, and who did not think to question why Thomas Hartley's daughter wanted to look through old paperwork. Duke, through all of it, remained her one unwavering companion, curled by the stove while she worked, walking the 3 miles up to the shaft with her every week she could manage it to be certain the hidden tunnel remained undisturbed, once even standing between her and a rattlesnake sunning itself across the trail with such calm and immovable purpose, that she never doubted again whose protection she walked under. Beyond the notebook and the ore samples, the hidden tunnel yielded its secret slowly, the way a wound reveals its full depth only once the bandage is finally lifted. Deeper inside, past the niche where the oilskin bundle had waited, Josephine found a second chamber her father had evidently cut himself, off the hours the company paid him for, its walls marked with his own careful survey chalk, showing the vein's true breadth and the direction it ran beneath the mountain, figures that matched almost exactly the numbers recorded in his notebook, and that told her, with a certainty no rumor could shake, that he had known precisely what he'd found, and precisely what it was worth. She found, too, a small tin box of his pipe tobacco, long gone dry and crumbled, and a folded scrap of paper in his hand, that was not a survey figure at all, but a note meant, she understood with an ache that nearly buckled her knees, for her mother, a few private lines about coming home safe, and building her a proper parlor, once the claim was settled fair, dated 4 days before the collapse. Duke lay through all of this with his chin on his paws just inside the tunnel mouth, watching her with the still, grave patience of a creature who understood, in whatever way dogs understand such things, that this ground held grief as well as gold, and would not be rushed toward either. It was inevitable, in a town as small as Larkspur Hollow, that word would travel of the orphaned Hartley girl who had bought the cursed shaft, and gone up the ridge road every week through a hard winter, and it was inevitable, too, that the word would eventually reach Silas Pruitt. He came to her at the boarding house himself, in the first thaw of spring, all soft courtesy and fatherly concern, and offered to buy the worthless claim back from her for the generous sum of $50. More money, he pointed out kindly, than she had seen in one place in her whole young life, and surely more sensible than a girl alone wearing herself down chasing a dead man's foolishness in a condemned hole. Josephine, who had learned patience if nothing else that winter, thanked him, and told him she would think on it, and watched from the window, as he walked away down the muddy street, and understood with a cold certainty that a man does not offer $50 for a worthless thing, unless the thing is not worthless at all. From that visit onward, matters in Larkspur Hollow turned harder for her. Pruitt was careful never to threaten her outright. He was too practiced a man for anything so clumsy. But the camp boarding house suddenly found it could no longer employ her, on account of a sudden shortage of work. The sheriff, a heavy, unhurried man named Cobb, rode up the Ridge Road twice that spring to inform her, with elaborate regret, that the shaft remained officially condemned, and that continued trespass upon it might be construed as a danger to the public and to herself. And a rumor began circulating through the town, seeded so gently that no one could say exactly where it started, that Thomas Hartley's daughter had gone a little strange with grief, digging in a dead man's grave like a woman not right in her mind. It was a cruel and clever kind of opposition, the kind that does not need to raise a fist, because it only needs to make a lonely 18-year-old girl feel, every day, a little more alone. She might have given up entirely, in those weeks, had it not been for a handful of townsfolk, who remembered her father's decency, and would not quite believe the rumors. Mr. Osgood the assayer's clerk-chief among them, and old Mrs. Calloway, who had roomed at the Hartley boarding house for a decade, and who began quietly bringing Josephine bread and coffee on the days she walked the ridge. And for Duke, who asked nothing of her, but her company, and gave back a loyalty that no rumor could touch. Through those hardest weeks of spring, Josephine came to understand a loneliness, sharper than any she had known even in the raw days after her mother's death, for grief, at least, the whole town had been willing to share with her, but suspicion was a thing people preferred to carry alone, and cast onto others, rather than bear themselves. She took in mending by lamplight, to keep herself fed once the boarding house work dried up, her fingers going stiff, and pricked over other women's hems, while her own hems still hid her mother's wedding ring, and more than one night, she sat by her cold little stove, with Duke's head heavy in her lap, and let herself wonder, briefly and honestly, whether Silas Pruitt's $50 might not be the wiser road after all. It was Duke, on the worst of those nights, who would rise and press his whole solid weight against her side, patient and unhurried, until the shaking in her hands quieted, and it was the memory of her father's small cramped handwriting, and the note meant for her mother, that would now never be delivered, that reminded her each time why patience, however costly, was the only currency she had left to spend. The matter came to its crisis on a warm morning in late June, when Sheriff Cobb arrived at the Ridge with 2 hired men and a wagon, bearing papers he said gave the county authority to permanently seal and dynamite the old shaft as a public hazard, on Pruitt's own petition, before the next week was out. Josephine stood at the barricade, with Duke pressed against her skirts, and understood that whatever proof lay buried in that hillside would be buried forever, this time past any digging, if she did not act within the day. She did not argue with the sheriff, having learned that arguing with men backed by other men's money accomplished nothing. Instead, she asked, with a calm she did not entirely feel, for 1 week's grace to remove her father's personal effects from the claim before it was sealed for good, a request modest enough that even Cobb, uneasy perhaps in some buried corner of his own conscience, could not quite refuse it in front of Mrs. Calloway and Mr. Osgood, both of whom had walked up with her that morning at her quiet asking, and both of whom now stood as witnesses to the request being made and granted. That week, Josephine did not merely remove her father's effects. She brought Mr. Osgood himself up the ridge, along with the district's circuit-riding federal mining inspector, a plain-spoken man named Hollis, who happened to be passing through the county on his regular rounds, and who Mr. Osgood, at Josephine's careful asking, had quietly arranged to delay his departure by 2 days. She showed them the false wall, the newer timbers, the hidden ore samples, and her father's notebook with its dated, specific, damning survey figures, and she watched Inspector Hollis's expression change from polite skepticism to something much graver, as he turned the notebook's pages himself and compared its figures against the company's public assay records that Mr. Osgood had brought along in his satchel, the two sets of numbers standing in flat, undeniable contradiction to one another. And it was Duke, in the end, who settled what little doubt remained, for as the men stood discussing the notebook, the dog trotted past them into the tunnel's deeper dark, further than Josephine had ever let him go before, and began scratching insistently at a loose stone in the tunnel's back wall, a stone that, once pried free, revealed a second, smaller cache that Josephine herself had never found. A strong box, damp but intact, containing Silas Pruitt's own private correspondence with an Eastern silent partner, letters in which he discussed, in his own careful hand, his intention to declare the North Ridge claim exhausted, and to quietly acquire the miners' small shares, before any of them learned otherwise, along with a ledger recording payments made to the county assayer's office to have the official reports altered to match his story. What followed moved faster than Josephine could have hoped, and slower than her nerves could easily bear. Inspector Hollis, armed with federal authority that no county sheriff's favor could override, ordered the shaft's demolition halted pending a full investigation, and within the month, a formal inquiry had been opened into the collapse that killed Thomas Hartley and two other miners, and into the falsified assay reports bearing the county's own seal. Silas Pruitt tried, for a time, the same soft courtesy that had served him all his life, calling the notebook a grieving girl's fantasy and the strongbox a plant, but the letters in his own unmistakable hand, and the corroborating testimony of the county assayer, who broke under the inspector's questioning and confessed to having been paid to alter the original figures, left him no room left to stand in. The town that had once whispered of a strange, grief-mad girl digging in a dead man's grave, now watched, in a kind of stunned collective reckoning, as the truth of what had been done to Thomas Hartley, and to every miner and shareholder Pruitt had quietly cheated in the years since, came into the daylight at last. In the days immediately following the strongbox's discovery, before the federal inquiry had even properly convened, word of what had been found up on the ridge moved through Larkspur Hollow faster than any rider could carry it, passed from the assay office, to the mercantile, to the church steps, until half the town seemed to know before nightfall that the Hartley girl had not been mad after all. Mrs. Calloway wept openly in the mercantile line, recounting how she had always said there was something owed to that family, though Josephine, hearing the story second-hand, only smiled and said nothing, having learned by then that towns remember their own courage more generously in hindsight than they show it in the living moment. Mr. Osgood, for his part, was called before the inquiry to testify to the altered assay reports he had helped Josephine compare, and though it cost him an uneasy afternoon under questioning, he told Josephine afterward, with the quiet satisfaction of a careful man finally allowed to be useful, that it was the finest day's work he'd done in 20 years behind that ledger book. Restoration, when it came, was not swift, but it was thorough, and it was just. The federal inquiry's findings forced a full accounting of the Pruitt Mining Concern's holdings, and under the settlement that followed, the North Ridge claim, properly surveyed at last, and found to hold every bit of the wealth Thomas Hartley had recorded in his notebook, was restructured as a cooperative venture, with shares distributed not to Silas Pruitt, but to the widows and families of every miner who had held even the smallest original stake in the old claim, Josephine Hartley chief among them, by right of both her father's original interest and her $1 deed to the shaft itself. Silas Pruitt, stripped of his falsified fortune, and facing criminal charges for the falsified reports and the deaths they had concealed, saw the very town council he had once funded and flattered vote unanimously to strip him of his seat, and within a season, he had sold what remained of his eastern holdings, to pay his fines, and left Larkspur Hollow altogether, A broken and diminished man in the same streets where he had once been bowed to, while the mine he had tried to bury quietly reopened under the collective name of every family it had wronged, with the town's new assay office papered, at Josephine's own quiet insistence, with a framed page from her father's notebook, so that no one walking through it would forget how close the truth had come to staying buried forever. The reopening itself was marked, that autumn, with a modest gathering at the mouth of the very shaft that had once been condemned and dollar-priced and dismissed, where the miners' widows and the town council, and even Inspector Hollis, back through the county on other business, stood together in the thin mountain sunlight, while Josephine cut a ribbon strung across timbers that were, at last, sound and new. Duke sat through the whole ceremony pressed against her boots exactly as he always had, entirely unimpressed by speeches, and it seemed to more than one person watching that a red hound's steady, uncomplicated loyalty had done as much to set things right in Larkspur Hollow as any federal inquiry ever could. It is worth remembering, in the end, that everything this story turned upon, the shaft, the girl, even the dog who found what grown men and official reports had tried to hide, had first been dismissed by the world as worthless. A condemned hole in a mountainside, sold for $1, because no one believed it held anything but bad memory and broken timber. An orphaned girl, with $46, and no family name left to lean on, whom the town was ready to write off as strange, even mad, for refusing to let her father's death rest as an accident. A red-coated hound, that anyone else might have called simply a good dog, and nothing more. But it was the overlooked shaft that held the fortune, the overlooked girl, who had the patience and the courage to uncover it, and the overlooked dog, whose nose and whose loyalty led the way, when neither law nor money would. Larkspur Hollow learned, that year, the same lesson its own name might have taught it all along, if anyone had thought to listen, that the things the world calls worthless are very often only waiting for someone patient enough, and loyal enough, to look closer. Thank you for spending this evening with Josephine, and with Duke, and with the buried truth of Larkspur Hollow. If their story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs a reminder that quiet persistence still counts for something in this world, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Here is a question worth sitting with as you go. What is there in your own life, dismissed by everyone else as worthless, that might simply be waiting for you to look at it a little longer? Until next time, stay close.